Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor and great privilege to welcome you all tonight to the opening evening of our Levy Forum here at the Palm Beach Synagogue. I want to thank our partners at ACTA for sponsoring this event every year together with Paul and Karen Levy. Thank you very much. So they tell a story of a Jew who's walking along the beach one day, and a bottle washes ashore, and he opens up the bottle and a genie comes out. And the genie says to him, I've been trapped in this bottle for thousands of years, make any wish and it will be granted. So the Jew says to the genie, when Moses led the Jews for 40 years in the desert, he took them to the one spot in the Middle East that has no oil. And as a result of that, the Jews are isolated. All our enemies, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, they all have oil wells, and we don't. So my one request would be if you could move the oil wells from all the Arab countries to Israel, that would be my one request. And the genie says, wow, that sounds like a big request. Do you happen to have a map of the Middle East? He says, I happen to carry one. Here it is. He gives it to him. He starts looking at the map. He says, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait. He says, that's a big job, moving oil wells underground, thousands of miles. He says, that's a little too big of a request. He folds up the map. He gives it back to the Jew. He says, ask for something else. So he says, okay, my second request would be, he says, we Jews are a tiny little nation. Only 13 million Jews. There are 1 billion Arabs, 2 billion Christians. He said, you would think we Jews would stick together, we would love each other, we would unite, support one another, because we have so many enemies around us, so many anti-Semites. But yet, Jews are often fighting with one another. This Jew is opposing this Jew, and this Jew is fighting with that Jew, and this one doesn't get along with this one. And then he says, if you could unite the Jewish people, that they should be one loving, united, cohesive group, that would be my second request. And the genie looks at the Jew and says, let me see that map again. Tonight we are at the opening night of the Levy Forum, which is generously sponsored by Paul and Karen Levy. Levy is actually one of the 12 tribes of Israel, Levi, and he's born in this week's Torah portion. And the meaning of the name Levy, the name was given by his parents, by his mother, Leah, and she said the word Levy means attachment. And may our family always be bonded. The 12 tribes of Israel, the family of Israel, should always be connected and bonded and attached. Levy means attachment to one another. And I want you to know that Levy is the tribe that all the leaders of Israel, the Kohanim, the Levites, Moses was a grandson of Levy, Aaron the high priest was a grandson from the tribe of Levy, Miriam the prophetess was from the tribe of Levy, because to be a Levy means that you bond the Jewish people, you bring the community together, you unite us as a people, and that's what leadership is, and that's what Paul and Karen represent to us. The Levy Forum's subtitle is Forum for Open Discourse, to learn to respect one another, to speak to one another, to foster understanding and mutual respect for one another through vision, through ideas that transcend all of us. Vision for the Jewish people, for Israel, for humanity. And I want to thank you once again, Paul and Karen, for your generosity. May God bless you to continue being the lights and the leaders you are in our community. It is now my great honor to call upon Mr. Paul Levy to open the evening.
The bloodlines run thin from those days, but I'll do my best to keep it up. Rabbi, did you tap my phone? Because my brief remarks are basically those which you just gave. So I'll keep it very short. Number one, thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much, Rabbi Minsky, for all that you've done. Michael Poliakoff from ACTA for making this possible. And of course, thank you, Sir Niall, for coming. And we look forward to hearing from you. I did want to say that I do I am committed to the idea of community. I am committed to the idea of discourse. I am committed to the idea of debate. I'm committed to the idea of disagreement. People can disagree. They should do so cordially, professionally, politely, and constructively. I think that's something we all have to realize. It is not about agreeing. The world doesn't move forward on agreement. The world moves forward on constructive disagreement, where different points of view are debated, discussed. It's Hegelian, point and counterpoint, thesis, antithesis, and that's the way things move forward. So hopefully what we're trying to create here is an environment of that sort. And I would say the following: picture a placid lake and into which you throw a pebble, and the ripples go on until they leave your field of vision. Conversations can be that way. Community can be that way. Throw a lot of pebbles into the lake, talk to people, and let's hope something good comes from it. So thank you all for coming, and thank you. We look forward to hearing from you.
It is an immense joy to see all of you here and to introduce our inaugural speaker for the third season of the Levy Forum, Sir Niall Ferguson. Last year, those of you who were with us will remember that the second season was inaugurated by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is now Lady Ayaan. And this year we have Sir Niall Ferguson to open the season. Lady Ayaan, as you will recall, is a humanitarian and women's rights activist, and Sir Niall, knighted for his contributions to literature, is a historian who is also helping us to mend a broken world, husband and wife, Tikkun Olam. This forum is the result of the vision and generosity of Paul and Karen Levy, who started it 2 years ago as a service to this community. And in addition to making the Palm Beach Synagogue the center that it is for spiritual rebirth, it answers to the vision of Rabbi Scheiner that the Palm Beach Synagogue will be the intellectual hub of Palm Beach and beyond through the podcasts and the videos. So thank you, Rabbi Scheiner. Thank you, Rabbi Minsky. You're gracious hosts, and you have been with us at every step in inspiring and refining our vision and implementation. And a thank you to Emily J. and Claire Doyle and Tracy Pang, my colleagues, who have supported all of this work to get this together. The Levy Forum is experiencing some geographical growth. Those of you who were with us last April when Bernard-Henri Levy spoke will remember that he had just written the French version of Israel Alone, and it prompted a partnership between the Levy Forum and Bernard-Henri Levy to combat campus anti-Semitism and hatred for Israel. And through the generosity of Paul and Karen and their friends, many of whom are here tonight, Bruce and Susie Kovner, Charles and Rita Bronfman, Alan Schuch, David Windreich, Paul Singer, and William Hyman, we were able to sponsor a 14-campus tour of campuses in Canada and the United States to push back against the loathsome and dangerous explosion of campus anti-Semitism. This is a labor of love for all of this and something that answers an urgent need. The Levy Forum will always be rooted in this synagogue, but the branches of that tree are now spreading across the nation. And I want to thank those of you who have supported the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. We are working constantly to maintain freedom of discourse on campus. And now we have an additional focus, which is religious freedom on campus so shamefully imperiled by so much of higher education. Sir Niall Ferguson, a life and a career dedicated to Tikkun Olam. Now, that may seem a little odd to be using that phrase about a historian, but what Sir Niall Ferguson brings to history is a recognition of its urgency, the lessons of history, how we apply it to making our lives better. The craft of the historian never compromises with accuracy and meticulous detail, but in Sir Niall Ferguson, we see its purpose, the thing that helps us mend a broken world. In his 16 books, a constant theme is the application of what all of that means. If you ask me which of his 16 books is my favorite, they range from House of Rothschild, Warburg, Civilization, The Great Degeneration. I'd be no more prepared to answer that than if you asked me which is my favorite child. They're all really quite wonderful. And of his book, Colossus, John Lewis Gaddis wrote, "No contemporary historian rivals Niall Ferguson for the range, productivity, and visibility of his scholarship." And that was in 2004. There's been quite a lot in the last 20 years. His journalism, and I urge everyone, if you haven't done it already, subscribe to the Free Press, is a model of bringing to the fore the most urgent issues of our times. He is the co-founder of the University of Austin, which just greeted its first class of students, and it is a model for the nation dedicated to the fearless pursuit of truth. Now, I could go on for quite a while, and I'm going to stop, but I'm just going to invoke Rabbi Hillel, speaking to myself as well as to everyone here. Go forth and study. We've been given wonderful materials by Sir Niall, and indeed, on the table in the foyer, you'll find copies of the speech that he gave in 2016, along with that his wife, Lady Ion, gave when they accepted the Merrill Award for outstanding contributions to liberal arts education. We were privileged at ACTA to present that award. And now, please welcome Sir Niall Ferguson.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Michael. Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Levy. Thank you, Rabbi, for welcoming me into your synagogue. Thanks to everybody who's come here tonight. Could we just pay tribute to the work of ACTA that Michael has led so courageously and so impressively? Not many people realized as early as Michael Poliakoff the crisis that was brewing in our universities, a crisis so dire that it led me to compare the state of the elite American universities in the 2010s and 2020s to the state of the elite German universities in the 1920s. And it took a hideous atrocity last year to cause many people to open their eyes to something that you and I, Michael, have been concerned about for 10 years. Ladies and gentlemen, full disclosure, I am not Jewish. I remember being told a very entertaining joke by Mort Zuckerman about the Jewish origins of the name Ferguson. And I have learned never to tell Jewish jokes, especially in front of Jewish audiences. But the punchline was Sean Ferguson. Sean Ferguson. For those of you who know the joke, that's all you need to know. And if you don't know the joke, look it up.
Scottish humour is slightly different. Scottish humour is like, I wonder how long this lectern is going to last. It's so wobbly, it's like Donald Trump dancing. And I have to say, I apologize if you voted for Kamala Harris, but I have been doing that dance right here in Palm Beach last night. I was at Mar-a-Lago, and I was in good company. Lee Greenwood was there. He sang Proud to be American, a song I first heard when I was sworn in as a U.S. citizen 6 years ago. Glenn Beck was there, and we were there to celebrate and support the work of Prager University. And I want to just mention Dennis. Dennis Prager is, as some of you may know, in a critically ill condition, having suffered a severe fall, and our thoughts and prayers are with him and his family. The great work he's done, I know, will carry on, and I'm very hopeful that he will recover from his injury. But we were in high spirits despite Dennis's accident. The culmination of my week, maybe my life, was dancing the Trump dance with my favorite Canadian professor, Gad Saad. President Trump put in an appearance, and I've never seen somebody walk on air that way before. I kept looking to see, are his feet touching the ground, or is he still walking 6 inches above the ground? I said very indiscreetly, and don't tell anybody I said this, I think I can get away with it here. I said very indiscreetly on the Hoover Institution show Goodfellows that Donald Trump's re-election was the biggest comeback since the resurrection, and I realized I should walk that back. Palm Beach feels like the center of the universe right now. It's like the fulcrum. There's some powerful gravitational force at work that causes all the traffic to stop around about Mar-a-Lago. And one senses an optimism, high spirits. Even, I think, those who were on the losing side of the election have a certain relief that there was a clear outcome. In this happy place, where the vibe shift feels very real, it's almost bad taste to think of a very different place. But I want you to do that. I want you to think about Vilnius. I want you to think about a city that was once the Jerusalem of the North, the greatest center of Jewish learning and culture in all of Europe. I would guess there are members of this audience with family roots in Lithuania. Put a hand up if you have a connection to. Okay. So, I went there for the first time just a couple of months ago. It's a pretty town. It's an attractive destination, beautiful Baroque architecture. If you didn't know the history, you wouldn't see the ghosts. Vilnius is a city of ghosts. So many people died. And they died as a result of historical forces none of them could control or anticipate. How could they foresee that the Jerusalem of the North would be for a time a Polish city and then would be taken over by Soviet Lithuania, and then would be overrun by the Nazis, who set about, with considerable assistance from local Lithuanian militias, massacring all the Jews of Vilnius and nearly all the Jews of Lithuania. No country in the Holocaust suffered a higher percentage of deaths than in Lithuania. As I walked around those streets, past the vanished synagogues, I remembered why I became a historian. Why, despite the fact that I was raised an atheist and recently became, along with my wife Ayan, a Christian, I have devoted a substantial part of my scholarly career to studying the history of your people. Because the tragedy that befell the Jews is the single most horrific event of history. And what makes it so horrific is that ultimately it was perpetrated by the most advanced of European countries. The country, Germany, that had, in the 1920s, the best universities in the world, the most Nobel Prizes of any country, the most advanced industrial and technological economy in Europe. The reason I became a historian was to try to understand the central problem that the Holocaust exemplifies. That not education, not modernity, not great music, not great literature, not great science, none of these things can inoculate us against evil. And to understand, as Tolstoy put it, what is the power that moves nations? The question he asks at the end of War and Peace. That has been my life's work. I posed a question to give myself a lecture title tonight. Cold War II or World War III? And I want to try, in a few brief minutes before we turn to discussion, to think about our present moment using these two analogies to try to illuminate where we are. Let's begin with Cold War II. Let's begin with the time in which Vilnius was in a deep freeze. The deep freeze of Cold War. The grip of Stalin, of Soviet power, had been reimposed on Lithuania and on Vilnius with the collapse of the Wehrmacht and the defeat of Hitler's Third Reich. And from then, from 1944-45, until the dissolution of the Soviet Empire between 1989 and 1991, history in Vilnius essentially stopped. Nothing was built, improved. The city was in a deep freeze. I'm old enough to remember the Cold War. I'm old enough to remember the Soviet Union. I'm old enough to remember the Stasi trailing me when I, as a student, visited East Berlin for the first time. And the question that I have asked myself repeatedly for the last 6 years is, are we in a new Cold War? Are we in Cold War II? And was that period after 1991 just an interwar period that ended at some point, perhaps as long ago as 2012, certainly sometime after 2016? Now, as I mentioned, I've devoted much of my career to Jewish history. The biography I'm still in the midst of writing of Henry Kissinger is a part of my effort to understand the modern Jewish experience. If anybody could answer the question, are we in Cold War II, it was Henry Kissinger. And so I asked him. And I had the sheer nerve, the chutzpah, to ask him in Beijing in November 2019 at a conference organized by Bloomberg. I had no idea how he would reply. After all, he was a man who had, more than any other Westerner, more than any other American, built the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. It's perhaps the achievement that many people most associate with him. Are we, Dr. Kissinger, I asked, in a new Cold War? He gave one of those pregnant pauses before replying. And his reply, I'll never forget, was this. We are in the foothills of a Cold War. In the foothills of a Cold War. What an answer. It's not often that you sort of feel a shiver of historical recognition go down your spine, but I felt it then. And a year later, he, in another interview with someone else, upgraded it to the mountain passes of a Cold War. Shortly before his 100th birthday, I asked him again about that question. And he said to me, the second Cold War will be more dangerous than the first. Now, if anybody was qualified to recognize a Cold War, it was surely Henry Kissinger, who was there at the beginning of the first Cold War, and there at the end of it. Two superpowers, ladies and gentlemen. One committed to capitalism and democracy, the other committed to Marxism-Leninism. Ideologically divided, in a technological competition with one another, not only in the field of nuclear weapons, but now also in the field of artificial intelligence, in the field of quantum computing. That, of course, was what Kissinger meant when he said, this is more dangerous because the technologies have become more potent, the weapons more accurate, our capacity for mass destruction even greater than it was in the First Cold War. Two superpowers in an economic competition with one another, and a closer economic competition than it ever was with the Soviet Union, whose economy was never larger than perhaps 44% of US GDP. By some measures, China overtook the United States in 2016. On a current dollar basis, not yet, but closer, certainly closer, let's say 66 or 68%, than the Soviets ever got. And this Cold War, like the First Cold War, has its geopolitical dimension. There are the flash points, the places you know are combustible, the places where the superpowers are in either direct or indirect collision. Look around the world. What do we see? War in Ukraine. Raging war, the worst war Europe has seen since 1945. How should we understand that war? Is it not somewhat similar to the way the Soviet Red Army crushed Hungarian resistance in 1956 crushed Czechoslovakian resistance in 1968, indirectly crushed Polish resistance in 1981? Or should we think of the war in Ukraine as like the Korean War, the first hot war of Cold War II, a war that divides a country in two, a war that for 1 year is extraordinarily kinetic and mobile and then becomes a war of brutal attrition until finally, out of exhaustion, an armistice is negotiated. There's a war in the Middle East, a war that you all know about, a war that officially broke out after October 7th last year, but in truth a war that had been simmering all along, a war that's now on 7 fronts by my count, a war that pits Israel not just against terrorist organizations such as Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah, but against Iran, against that monstrous octopus of intolerance and hate. How should we think about that conflict? Is it, by analogy with Cold War I, our 1973, 50 years ago, almost exactly to the date, 50 years before October 7th, another surprise attack on Israel? These analogies are powerful analogies, and they raise a further question. Is there another regional conflict waiting to flare up in this second Cold War? And if so, where? Think of it as, in some measure, a Cold War in mirror image. If the first Cold War was a transatlantic conflict primarily, where the great flashpoints were in the Atlantic world, but the hot wars mostly happened in Asia, Cold War II is a trans-Pacific conflict, a conflict between Washington and Beijing. And the flashpoints, the most dangerous places, are therefore in the Pacific world, Taiwan. The most dangerous island in the first Cold War was Cuba, a little island very close to the United States, which in 1962, the United States blockaded. We called it a quarantine. John F. Kennedy did, but it was in truth a blockade. And Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, had to decide, do I send a naval expeditionary force to run the blockade and risk World War III? Imagine a role reversal. Taiwan is an island off the coast of China that China is preparing, rehearsing the blockade of. And what will the United States do in the event of that blockade? Will our president find himself in the situation of Nikita Khrushchev, obliged to send an expeditionary force across the Pacific to run the blockade and risk World War III? If one thinks about Cold War II in that way, you rapidly arrive at the conclusion that the United States faces imminently the most dangerous moment of this Cold War. The Taiwan semiconductor crisis is likely to happen in the term of this newly elected president, because Bill Burns, the director of Central Intelligence, has more than once said that Xi Jinping has ordered his generals to be ready for war in 2027. It is also worth bearing in mind that we do not have a particularly credible strategy to deter Xi Jinping from blockading Taiwan. In fact, in all the war games of which I'm aware, the unclassified ones, the scenario of a blockade produces a very ugly outcome indeed, a large-scale war with extremely heavy casualties on both sides. In this framework, it's tempting to ask if it's time to dust down Dr. Kissinger's strategy of détente to avoid the kind of showdown that would bring us to the brink of World War III, but in the disadvantageous position of Khrushchev in 1962. Now that's the good news. The bad news is, you can see why my last book was called Doom. It's actually an ironical title. More about that later. World War III is my alternative analogy. Think about not the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Think about the 1930s. The great powers have disarmed. They thought the age of war was over and the peace dividend could be paid out indefinitely. At home, domestic opinion on both sides of the Atlantic had turned against forever wars. An isolationist mood in the United States, a pacifist mood in Europe. Meanwhile, the emergence of autocratic regimes and neo-imperial Russia under President or would-be Tsar Vladimir Putin, a Marxist-Leninist China under Xi Jinping, determined to reimpose the power of the Chinese Communist Party. And then these strange bedfellows join forces. China begins to support Russia's imperial project to reimpose its power on Ukraine. Without Chinese economic assistance, the Russian war effort would not have been sustainable until today. Vast exports of Chinese dual-use equipment and now also lethal equipment have kept the Putin war machine running. An axis has formed. This was one of the unintended consequences of the foreign policy of Joe Biden. This axis has grown in the past 2.5 to 3 years. It was joined by Iran, which began to supply Putin's war machine with drones. Most recently, it's been joined by North Korea, which has sent troops to fight on Russia's side against Ukraine. When David Frum used the phrase axis of evil in 2002, he did history a disservice. There was no axis in 2002. There is an axis today. And in many ways, it's a more formidable axis than the axis of 1939-40 that united Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. What to do? What if it's not the Cuban Missile Crisis we have to worry about, but the outbreak of a world war, but in some senses has already commenced? When did World War II begin exactly? In a book called The War of the World, I tried to answer that question. The answer is not September 1939. War had already, for all intents and purposes, begun. It had already begun in China with Japan's incursions into Manchuria and beyond. It had already begun in Spain. It had already begun if you were in Czechoslovakia. The nightmare scenario for us is that World War III is already in some measure underway, and the danger exists that it can escalate as it did in 1939. If that is the case, then it seems to me the urgent imperative for the United States is to reestablish deterrence as soon as is humanly possible. All the talk of de-escalation that has characterized the last nearly 4 years has been, in truth, a self-delusion. It turns out that de-escalation is the functional opposite of deterrence. Peace through strength. That is the president-elect on the phone. Please tell him I'm very busy. If one thinks in these terms about our time, then the significance of October 7th changes. To me, as soon as I saw the images that came out of Israel on that grim day, it was clear what was intended. October 7th was a trailer for a second Holocaust. That was how it was intended. And as we remember, as we do every day, the victims of those hideous atrocities, those who were raped as well as those who were killed, those who were kidnapped and are still in miserable captivity, we should understand the message that was being sent. And it was a message not only to Jews, it was a message to all of us who cherish the ideals of Western civilization and mean it and have meant it when we said, never again. It is the moral obligation, not just of Jews, but of all of us, whatever our faith. All of us whose grandfathers, as mine did, fought in the world wars. It is our responsibility to carry on the work they did and make the sacrifices that they did if we need to ensure that it cannot and must not and will not happen again. Even the grotesque anti-Semitic demonstrations that broke out on campuses and in cities from London to as far away as Sydney were, to me, a reminder of why I work, of what it is that I try to achieve, why I write books, why I give speeches, why I write for Barry, why I give video lectures for Dennis, why I tweet, why I try to educate, why history matters and cannot be allowed to be turned into some perverse sideshow in the identity politics circus of modern academia. I'm coming to the end of my remarks. George Orwell described Cold War. He defined Cold War in an astonishingly prescient essay published in 1945 as a peace that is no peace. It's a brilliant essay. He was a genius. He saw and understood as soon as he read the news of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that a new age had dawned in which nuclear-armed superpowers would be in an existence of peace that is no peace, unable to go to war because of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear Armageddon, unable to be at peace because of their mutual suspicions. I think our situation today is somewhat different. I'd characterize it as a war that is no war. The war is ongoing. It is constant. It is ongoing in cyberspace. It is ongoing in space. It is a war that ultimately will be fought in every domain with every technology that we can deploy in pursuit of strategic predominance. And you might conclude from that the outlook is very bleak. But I don't think it necessarily is. I want to conclude by telling you my reasons for optimism and why we can learn from history how to avoid both Cold War II and World War III. Our foes are very weak, in truth. Iran is weak. They have no succession plan. They turn out to have no air offensive capability and no air defense capability. The tentacles of the octopus have been lopped off. The Israeli government has achieved more in the past 3 or 4 months than anyone thought possible. Hamas is all but destroyed. Hezbollah has been decapitated and eviscerated. Israel now has the option to wage a war against Iran that could, with American support, put an end to that regime's plans to have nuclear weapons, plans that can never be fulfilled, so long as they so clearly intend to destroy the state of Israel. And we, by contrast, we have strengths. As I've been trying to understand the events of 2024, my mind keeps going back to another election that another Republican president won. And that election was that of 1980. Ronald Reagan was widely regarded as a cowboy by liberals and Europeans. A B-movie star who had no business being president of the United States. The cartoons that were published at the time of Reagan's election in newspapers like The Guardian will look quite familiar to you because they so closely resemble the cartoons that those newspapers publish of Donald Trump today. Ronald Reagan ran in 1980 on some slogans that you may remember. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Peace through strength. He also used a phrase that's become familiar in these parts. Make America great again. Ronald Reagan used that phrase on the campaign trail in 1980. And what Reagan teaches us, and I think about this more and more, is that peace through strength is attainable. The old Roman adage applies. Si vis pacem, para bellum. If you wish peace, prepare for war. Ronald Reagan's arms build-up, which of course greatly disconcerted the liberals and the Europeans, was of course the motive force that began the process whereby the Soviet leadership, dismayed at their technological backwardness, embarked on reforms that ultimately were fatal to their system. Reagan's courageous challenges to the evil empire, his readiness to call on Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. My colleague at Hoover, Peter Robinson, wrote that famous line, and if I ever write one line that impactful, I'll die happy. What is extraordinary about 1980 was that it began a process that ended the First Cold War, although the end came on George H.W. Bush's watch. It was clear at the time of his election that the game was up for the Soviet system. I even wrote an op-ed that never got published with the headline, "The Berlin Wall is Crumbling," and the editor of the Daily Mail declined to publish it on the grounds that, Neil, you've been listening to too many Ronald Reagan speeches. Cold War I ended and World War III did not happen, despite all the hand-wringing and anxiety that I remember from those days by organizations like the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. So although we have reason to be concerned that we may find ourselves in Cold War II, and we should consider the nightmare scenario that we are in the early innings of World War III, there is another way. There is another way where the United States exploits its unique ability to attract talent, give it capital, and establish technological leadership that no totalitarian regime can hope to match. What we need to have peace through strength is, of course, that national unity which came to be such a striking feature of the 1980s. But one looks back on with a certain amazement when one sees video coverage. I think, despite all the endless talk of polarization, of which I'm heartily sick, what we learnt on the night of November 5th, 6th, is that Americans of every color, of every age, male, female, have had enough of certain progressive ideas. We call them wokeism for short, and have had enough of weakness abroad, and have had enough of red tape and debt in their economy. So, I've come a long way this evening from Lithuania, from the graveyards and ghosts of Vilnius, back here to this wonderful synagogue in Palm Beach, the center of the universe. I would love to say it's morning in Donald Trump's America, but it's actually dinner time in Donald Trump's America. Thank you very much indeed.